If you have at all followed or paid attention to the list of recent releases, you will have probably heard of Path of Exile 2. It released into early access with quite a lot of fanfare a bit ago and has been making the rounds among streamers, YouTubers and gamers alike ever since. The endgame content reveal video put out by the developer is sitting at 3.3 million views at the time of me writing this paragraph. The game has had over 1 million signups to its $30 buy-in early access program, and it's routinely pulling in daily peak Steam player numbers twice those of the all-time peak of its predecessor, and that's disregarding all the other platforms. A lot of people seem to be really into this game, but the praise has not exactly been universal. For example, if you were to form your opinion on PoE 2 solely from what's being said about it on the Path of Exile 1 subreddit, you'd probably think it was a monumental failure, something akin to Conquer the Golem. But go on the Path of Exile 2 specific subreddit instead, and even though you'll see some criticism here and there, overall the sentiment is actually very positive, generally being in the spirit of this game is great, but this or that thing needs to be improved. And so, if you're an outsider to all this, you'll probably have absolutely no clue who to listen to when deciding on whether or not this game is worth your time or money. And the answer is, obviously you should listen to me, because all of my takes and opinions are objectively correct and I have never been wrong about anything in my entire life. Okay, but seriously, I'm currently sitting at just a bit over 100 hours put into this game, which is an absolutely absurd amount if you consider that the game has been out for like 10 days at the time of me writing this, and that I also have a full-time job. So needless to say, I am absolutely in love with it, but that doesn't mean I'm gonna recommend this game to literally everyone. There are some caveats I want to mention, both related to the fact that the early access is essentially a giant glorified playtest, as well as Path of Exile 2's very nature and design philosophy, as I'm sure not everyone is going to exactly vibe with it. Should you buy it now, wait a year, or skip on it entirely? Well, let's talk about it, shall we? Welcome to Raven's Blade, I'm your host GW, and this is Path of Exile 2. So, what exactly is this game all about? Well, it's an ARPG, or you could also call it a Diablo clone, a descriptor more accurate than you might initially think. Basically, you have your guy who runs around and smacks monsters, said monsters drop loot that makes your guy stronger and better able to take on harder monsters, which then drop even better loot, and on it goes until eventually you're hundreds of hours deep into perfecting your character, having made the full journey beginning with running away from the zombies in the starting areas, and ending with tackling some of the hardest content and bosses this game has to offer. The introduction to the game is honestly as good as it gets. You're washed ashore after barely escaping a failed execution, the only friendly face in the area gets his face bitten off shortly after you meet him, the entire place is dark, gloomy, rainy and filled with the undead, and the first boss you encounter is dangerous enough to just straight up one-shot you if you're not careful enough. The entire campaign onwards is straight up a work of art. Visually the game is stunning, the graphics, the sound design and the soundtrack work so well together to build a wonderful dark fantasy atmosphere and fully immerse you within it. There are so many examples of beautiful environment design here. I won't go in too much detail about it as I don't want to spoil this game's campaign for you too much, but this Act 1 zone, the Hunting Grounds, has to be one of my favorites. Just listen to this.
Fate is on my side.
If this zone isn't an obvious homage to Diablo 2 and the Wilderness theme, then I honestly don't know what is. And to be honest, the entire campaign itself feels like one huge love letter to Diablo 2. Just think about it. In Act 1, you're wandering through dark, cursed woodlands. At the end of it, you travel east into the dunes and deserts of Act 2. Act 3 then takes you on a journey into the jungle, as you explore the Aztec-inspired ruins. One of the first quests in Act 1 makes you go and defeat a big monster in a cave right outside the first town gates. Afterwards, you find a mysterious guy bound to a tree who will guide you on your journey, travel with you and identify your items throughout your campaign. Then at some point you make it to a cemetery and fight Draven, and I mean for God's sake, just look at the quest log, it's literally Diablo 2 quests. In its current state, the campaign only has 3 acts out of the planned 6, with more to be added on release, and I genuinely cannot wait for that because this is hands down the single greatest campaign I have ever played in an ARPG period. The boss fights are sick, the story is gripping, some of the voice acting performances are simply outstanding.
Just wait, surely we can... is littered with death. Justice now fight.
The environments are amazing, the Act 2 town is so fucking cool with it being a caravan with a map that you use to traverse the desert and get to various points of interest, and you get to visually see the caravan stop next to the zone you're about to enter, completely in sync with the zone's visuals and time of day, and I think it's such a missed opportunity to not use it for the endgame mapping system. Seriously, I absolutely cannot get enough of this place. It's also incredible just how many gorgeous set pieces they've managed to cram into the various areas you visit throughout your adventures. I can't even count how many times I've gone into a zone and been completely blown away by the visuals. Some have criticized the campaign zones for being overly large, and I'd say there is some truth to that. Acts 1 and 2 felt perfect to me, while Act 3 zones might be a little bit too expansive, but I think most of the complaints have to do with how you approach the campaign. In PoE 1, the point of it was for you to run through it and get to the endgame as quickly as possible. It didn't start off particularly strong, and the quality would then drop significantly once you went past Act 5. It was a boring slog made tolerable mainly by the fact that the seasoned player was able to speedrun through it in just a few hours and quickly get to the content they actually enjoy, which is endgame maps. PoE 2's campaign, on the other hand, is a lot more ambitious. It wants to be an integral part of the game's core experience, not just a glorified tutorial for new players and a way to introduce the most recent expansion's new mechanic to seasoned veterans before the game finally starts for real. It forces you to engage with it on a way deeper level due to its sheer size and difficulty. Believe me, you will struggle with it on your first character, no matter how good you are at video games. Even the best PoE players didn't start off playing this game on hardcore right away for a reason, and as such, whatever pain points it may have will be that much more prominent. But hopefully in return, once you get used to the game and these pain points get addressed, you'll start to enjoy the campaign experience a lot more. For those used to the way Path of Exile 1 does things, it'll likely take some adjustments, but for those completely new to PoE, I think it works wonders to advertise the game and entice them into continuing their playthrough. I've had a few friends get into PoE 2 without any prior experience, and they are all just as addicted to the game as I currently am, if not even more. It's not just thanks to the amazing campaign, it's also helped a lot by the quality of life features that the game has. Path of Exile is a game known for its incredible complexity and depth. I mean, just look at the game's goddamn skill tree. Yeah, exactly, what the fuck, right? But then there's also this whole active skill gem system, where each skill gem can have support gems which can drastically alter how the skill behaves, and sometimes skill gems can act as support gems for certain other skills, and then there's persistent skills, there's skills meant to combo with other skills, there's skills that generate resources and skills that use those resources to power themselves up. It's a whole thing, and Path of Exile 2 has this awesome feature where if you're confused about the way a mechanic works, you can just hold Alt and hover your mouse over a keyword you want to learn more about, and you can just keep going deeper and deeper until you've got it all cleared up, or until your dopamine receptors are satisfied. They even play narrated visual previews for each individual skill if you're unsure what it does and its description text is too confusing, which in my opinion is brilliant. All this complexity makes it really easy to get overwhelmed, so I really like how they've provided new players with ease of access to a lot of important information on the game's mechanics, as well as a streamlined selection of recommended skill and support gems. I mean, hell, I have several hundred hours in PoE 1 and I still consider myself a total noob, so I've been loving this stuff as well. There's definitely a bunch of information still missing, but what's in so far should already be enough to get you started, and I'm confident they'll keep working on demystifying the game's systems more and more as time goes on. Another big reason why someone could struggle while playing through the campaign is their build. Path of Exile 2 is extremely open in its design, with each class sharing for the most part the exact same skill tree, but starting in different locations on that tree, and as such everyone is allowed to use whatever skill gem combination they desire, which allows for a lot of creativity, but also leaves you with many opportunities to mess up and create a very ineffective build for yourself. My first character ended up being pretty strong because he was really straightforward to play and gear up. I do lightning damage with lightning skills, so I guess I should scale into lightning damage on the skill tree is a pretty foolproof plan as it turns out. But when I tried making something really scuffed work, I naturally started running into a lot of difficulties going through zones without dying, and even when I'd manage it was always an uphill battle and took absolutely forever. So I think if you ever are in a situation where you're going through the campaign feeling powerless, it's probably because your build sucks, and depending on how stubborn you are, it might be time to either go back to the drawing board and try and come up with something more effective, or give up and copy someone else's build, at least to start with. That said, I love how much easier it is to create your own build in PoE 2 compared to PoE 1, but given that the game is still in early access and like half of the skill gems are missing, build diversity is probably not going to be too great for a while, and at least some skills feel like they're missing certain synergies that just aren't in the game as of yet and kinda suck as a result. As far as the game's balance is concerned, well, it's definitely far from perfect, with devs already having done several large nerfs to certain builds and skill combinations not even a week into early access, and they've promised to keep adjusting things as time goes on, and I definitely appreciate that, but at the same time I can sympathize with people coming back from their day jobs eager to finally play their crazy setup they saw somewhere online, only to find out it doesn't work anymore due to a patch released 2.5 hours prior. This is one of the reasons why I don't want to blanket recommend this game just yet. Depending on your situation, how much time you're ready to put into this game, and how willing you are to put up with the possibility of a build getting essentially patched out of the game at any time, it could be better to wait until the full release. To be fair though, they do allow you to respect your character at any time, provided you have enough gold, and gold itself is pretty easy to come by from my experience, but hey, something to keep in mind for sure. What you will not be able to respec, however, is your choice of character class and ascendancy. Currently the game has 6 classes, with 2 ascendancies each. Ascendancies are basically a way for you to further specialize your class into what it is exactly that you want to do. The full release is supposed to have 12 different classes with 3 ascendancies each. That's a lot, especially given the fact that your ascendancy can drastically alter the way you play. For example, the Witch has the Blood Mage ascendancy, which makes all his spells cost life as well as mana. Now you might hear this and think, why would you ever want to take this? But the trade-off is that once you kill or land a crit on an enemy, you create these gloves of blood that give you life on pickup and let you overflow your health pool to double that of its maximum size. And further ascendancy points will let you, for example, beef yourself up a ton and then get crit damage based on how much life you have. So naturally, the way you're gonna play such a character is going to be pretty different compared to if you were to instead take the Infernalist ascendancy, which has an Infernal Dog and some other funky stuff. Look, I didn't actually read what it does, but just take my word for it, okay? It's different. Blood Mage is still kinda bad, by the way. Definitely still playable, don't get me wrong, but trying to make something somewhat underpowered work can feel quite frustrating, and it sucks to have to find out the build you've been trying to make work for the past 20 to 30 hours isn't what you expected it to be, and the only course of action is to go back to the drawing board, farm some respec gold and do something completely different, or ditch the character, create a new one, and subsequently have to replay all of the game's content all over again. Now, if you're in any way familiar with top-down action RPGs, you might have noticed something unusual about how this one plays from looking at my gameplay footage so far. That's right, you don't actually move around with your mouse. I mean, you can if you want to. The game asks you at the very start if you want to stick with the traditional click to move or adopt a newer WASD control scheme, but the game overall has been designed around the latter, and honestly, I found it to be pretty damn great. In PoE 1, if you wanted to attack or cast a spell, your character always had to stop to perform that action, unless it had movement built into it, but not anymore, and it really helps make the game feel so much more responsive. Being able to dodge around enemy attacks while throwing lightning at them feels fantastic, and I really appreciate having more granular control over exactly how far I want to move in this or that direction. To be fair, click to move also allows movement during attacks, but I found WASD to feel so natural I never really bothered switching away from it. Which brings me to the overall feel of the combat in PoE 2. In the interviews before the early access release, the developers have discussed at length how they wanted to make the combat a lot better, deeper, and more engaging than what you typically see in these kinds of games. And in my opinion, they have for the most part succeeded in that endeavor. Take a look at my current character, for example, a cold and lightning damage monk. For long range, I for the most part use a combination of Storm Wave, a long range lightning strike that also causes freeze buildup, and Charge Staff, a buff that consumes the power charges I generate each time I freeze someone to turn my weapon into a lightsaber, imbuing my attacks with added lightning shockwaves. That buff also synergizes with Tempest Flurry, a skill I use to deal damage to those in close proximity to me. And finally, I have the ability to slam down a giant bell on a cooldown and start hitting it for incredible single target damage, especially if I manage to shock or freeze with my attacks, and on occasion I also create a mount device to help with freeze buildup. If you didn't catch all that, that's fine. The point is, the minute-to-minute combat ends up being quite involved, with me always picking and choosing what skill to use given the situation, while also having to worry about my positioning, moving around while attacking, and dodge rolling out of big hits that could one-shot me if I'm not careful. Compare that to the build I had in Path of Exile 1's most recent League in expansion, Settlers of Kalgua, where, while I had a lot of buffs to keep up, it didn't go past hitting the same 5 or 6 buttons in the exact same sequence every 4 to 5 seconds, and otherwise the action largely consisted of me holding down my right click button to kill a pack of mobs and spamming my movement skill to get to the next pack as quickly as possible. As far as I'm aware, you're still able to make builds that basically play themselves, but the developer's intention is to make them not as strong as those that require more mechanical effort, and I personally applaud this decision of removing the boring busywork of keeping up 17 different buffs and auras all the time while making the mechanical bits of combat more engaging. It's been one of my biggest complaints about the first game for years, and I'm so happy to finally have an alternative to it. The boss fights also feel fantastic. Granted, you don't always get to actually enjoy their mechanics. If your build is really strong, you can get away with just holding down your attack buttons, stunlocking the boss and bursting them down before they get to respond in any way, shape or form, but my build doesn't allow me to do that every time. And so far, I've yet to encounter a boss that I didn't have fun having to play around the mechanics of. I cannot stress enough just how much the ability to move while attacking does to make the fights feel good. It's so much more fun dodging boss mechanics with a movement system that's actually fluid and allows for micro adjustments, unlike PoE 1, which felt almost tile-based at times. And I love the fact that I'm never locked into fully finishing the attack or cast I erroneously initiated, as I can always cancel out of it by using the dodge roll. I've seen a lot of people make comparisons to Elden Ring or Dark Souls when talking about the combat system in this game, and personally I don't really agree with them. Yes, the combat can be hard and methodical, yes you have a dodge roll mechanic, but the purpose of the dodge roll is just not the same. You're never expected to use it several times over to dodge a combination of attacks like you would in those games. The vast majority of the time the attacks are avoidable by noticing the wind-up ahead of time and just walking away from them. The roll is there to allow you to correct your mistakes, not rely on it to get through content. This is further communicated by just how slow the tail end of the roll's animation is. And that makes sense, as it gives you a burst of speed right as you use it, and the game has no stamina bar to speak of, further dispelling the notion that it's copying Dark Souls somehow, and obviously the developers don't want you to be able to just spam the roll ad nauseum to make your character go faster. I've definitely died quite a number of times, but for the most part all my deaths have felt fair. Either I fucked up, or I stopped paying attention, or I wasn't familiar with the attack patterns, or I simply wanted to zone way too high level for my character and paid the price. I also have not had many issues with visual clarity. It can definitely get quite crazy at times, but apart from a few oddly behaving bosses, it's all been a pretty smooth experience overall. So far we've talked about the campaign, we've talked about the combat, but at the end of the day, let's not forget what it is that we're fighting for: more XP and better gear. And none of the things I've mentioned so far really matter if the loot you get in a looter game isn't up to par. So, does PoE 2 have good loot? In my opinion, yes, absolutely, 100%. I am currently in the end game and have been for a couple dozen hours at the very least, and I'm still picking up items, identifying them and comparing them to my current gear, which I think is awesome. I love the fact that I'm able to actually find half decent loot off the ground instead of having to trade for it or spend hours messing around with several different arcane crafting systems all at the same time. Don't get me wrong, crafting still exists and you still have to do it if you want to get good loot without trading with other players for it, but the actual system through which you do it is far more straightforward than that of PoE 1. The Exalted Orb, the primary currency which you use to trade with other players, is the one that lets you add a new modifier to an existing rare item, and also conveniently it drops quite frequently in the endgame. I find the process of finding loot, checking if it has anything worthwhile or not, and using my exalts on it in the case that it does quite enjoyable. It's like gambling, but at worst I can only lose a little bit of time, and at best I can create something awesome from a build and get a major power boost. I really like how I'm actually using the currencies I'm dropping instead of holding them forever and mainly just trading with them, because the drop chance is so low that using them for any other purpose would be a waste. So I really love this change that they made from PoE 1 to PoE 2. The developers have made a number of changes to Path of Exile's loot system besides that. First, they have severely reduced the amount of clutter and useless stuff that drops as you play, making the game actually playable without a loot filter turned on instead of whatever the fuck this abomination is. And secondly, sometimes you get extra valuable tiered items that can only roll higher modifier values. So if you pick up and identify one of those, you know the chance it turns out to be good is a lot higher. The loot pinatas are for the most part gone, unless you're running some crazy endgame map juicing strats, but I personally welcome the change. I'd rather drop less stuff but have the stuff that does drop be more valuable, than have loot explosions everywhere with all of that loot being complete unusable trash. In the beginning of early access, loot was probably a little bit too scarce. I'm saying probably because my experience has been quite smooth, but I've seen a lot of complaints about people straight up not getting anything in the first couple of access. Apparently the loot drops could be super swingy, so it seems to have been an issue at the very start, but that was swiftly addressed, and honestly the developer reacting this quickly to complaints is exactly what you'd want out of an early access title. My main concern is that they don't overreact and go back on their current design philosophy. I personally think it's great just how different this game feels from its predecessor, and I hope they keep going down that route instead of turning it into PoE 1 with a fresh coat of paint. Finally, let's talk about the endgame. PoE 2's endgame is definitely one of the endgames of all time, by which I mean it's there, but it's probably the roughest part of the game as it stands right now. The main mechanic you interact with is this map right there, which you traverse by slotting waystones into individual nodes, with the waystone tier determining the level and difficulty of the area, and the map node determining the tile set, layout, and the mechanics it will contain. Now and then you'll also encounter these towers, which reveal a large area of the overworld map upon getting cleared, and also allow you to slot in precursor tablets that modify the map nodes in a radius around the tower, making them more rewarding to run. The concept itself is pretty cool, but I wish there was a bit more layout diversity. Some layouts are really annoying to run, seriously fuck Maya and fuck Sun Temple, and I'd like to see more flavor and quality of life for the world map itself. So for example, making biomes matter more than they currently do, or doing something cool with continents, letting you zoom out further and searching different parts of the map up, and so on and so forth. The primary goal of traversing the map is discovering citadels, which give you fragments that you need to gain access to the big bad boss. I have not managed to get enough of them to try the boss out so far myself, which is unfortunate since the fight itself looks really cool and fun. In theory, I wouldn't really mind it taking so long if the game also had enough supplementary endgame mechanics to do while you're on the lookout for those citadels. Unfortunately, that is not the case. In reality, currently there's just one genuinely fleshed out supplementary endgame mechanic, which is Breach, and the rest are just kind of underwhelming. Ritual is pretty decent with some nice potential rewards. Problem is, these rewards are so rare that you'll probably never find any yourself. Then there's Delirium, which makes everything look like shit, and Expedition, which is completely nerfed compared to its PoE 1 rendition, and is so obviously rushed you don't even get a separate lock for all the mechanic specific currency like you do in that game. Overall, it's all still pretty fun, and there are still plenty of things to do, especially if you're new and have not interacted with these mechanics in PoE 1, but it clearly doesn't hold a candle to the level of quality and polish of the campaign, and honestly, I'm not a huge fan of the gameplay becoming more and more similar to the first game the more and more you scale your character. A couple other points to touch on before we wrap things up. While I really like the control scheme overall, the controller style aim assist that comes with WASD movement for some reason is quite annoying, and I hope they let me turn it off at some point. A number of enemies create explosion style visuals when they die, but confusingly enough, only some of them create actual explosions that can kill you. Trading with other players can get supremely annoying, but that's less of a Path of Exile 2 issue and more of a people issue. Sounds all the times the trade website just goes down at random times throughout the day, which is definitely not a people issue. I've mentioned ascendancies, but I feel I also have to mention the way you actually get them, which is through running one of the 2 available gauntlets, which are both pretty damn difficult. Many people have voiceover complaints about that system. Personally, I don't really mind the idea of having to fight for character power in this way, but I seem to be in the minority here, so while I enjoy running these trials for the most part, there's a good chance you will not, especially if you play a class that's not as mobile as mine is, or one that doesn't have range capabilities that are as good. The co-op play is there for those of you who want it, it's fine, it's functional, but it obviously wasn't the focus of their testing as it can get a bit clunky at times. A common example is having to manually teleport to each other at times because for some reason the game just decided to put you in 2 separate instances of the same area, and the mechanics of some areas are a little bit janky to interact with as a group. The game is online only, after all it's supposed to be free to play once it goes out of early access. I haven't had any connection issues so far, and the technology behind the game is honestly incredible. For example, despite every area instance being hosted on a server somewhere, you're allowed to pause in an online game. And if you are in an area together with party members and you all pause the game, the instance gets paused as well. Isn't that crazy? So far I've only crashed once. It happened while I was trying to fight my way out of a super dense pack of monsters, and I honestly thought I was done for. But no, I reopened the game and I'm safe and sound with my map still being open and none of my XP or progress missing. I've seen instances of mobs and skills disappearing or acting in a funky way, but such things are quite few and far between. Oh, and right at the beginning of the endgame I was having issues with every other map instance crashing and not letting me in, but as soon as I unlocked a hideout and started running maps from there, it all went away. So even though it sucks that such a problem exists to begin with, at the very least you're able to avoid it relatively easily. The game runs very well for me on my setup, which is admittedly quite high end, but it's not the absolute cream of the crop, and I'm generally left with quite a lot of FPS headroom. So I think if your machine is reasonably modern, you should be just fine. There's only one area I consistently get FPS drops in, that is here while the mobs are spawning, and that is honestly quite annoying, but otherwise everything's super smooth and stable. Just make sure your renderer is set to anything other than DirectX 11, because that thing will lag even on a supercomputer. So, in conclusion, should you eat the $30 price tag and buy into the early access of Path of Exile 2? As much as I love the game, it depends. If you're willing to pay the money to play a worse and more limited version of the game set to come out in a year from now, although there's a high likelihood it'll take a bit longer than that, and you don't mind acting like a playtester, I think it's worth it. After all, the game is absolutely fantastic, and it's not like your money ends up being wasted once it comes out for real anyway. With your $30 you'll get not just early access to the game, but also 300 points for their microtransaction store, which sells cosmetics to pimp your guy out, and much more importantly, stash tabs. The game is completely playable without having any stash tabs other than the 4 you get for free, and you'll definitely be able to easily make it through the entire campaign even when all the 6 acts eventually come out with just that. But if you want to seriously take on some of the later challenges, you'll probably want to pick up a couple stash tabs for the extra quality of life. Oh, and by the way, just to make it clear, outside of that, you cannot buy character power in any way. And even in the case of stash tabs, you're never buying character power, you're mostly just buying convenience. I think that while Path of Exile 2 still has quite a way to go towards feeling like a fully finished product, the level of polish that already exists is crazy and would genuinely be more than acceptable for even a full release of literally any other ARPG title. There's a lot to love here. Whether you're a casual player just looking to play through the campaign once and put the game away for an undetermined amount of time, or if you want to get into the endgame stuff and go as hard as you can. So, if you think you've got the money, don't mind the game being in a state of flux for a while, are itching to smack some monsters, fight some epic bosses and farm up some sick loot, and don't mind playing a game that's perhaps on the more hardcore and difficult side, it's an absolute no-brainer. But if you prefer to wait till all the kinks get worked out and all the 6 acts of the campaign are in the game, then hey, I guess I'll see you in a year or two. For now, that's about it from me. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you all next time, whenever that may be.